Hello, everyone. Welcome to Their Journey, a sit down with the National Digest. I'm your host, Eric Mastrota, and today I once again have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Allan Gold, a retired school psychologist who spent his career and life creating spaces for kids in school to feel heard, informed, and safe as they come of age. If you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out our two previous episodes with Dr. Gold, where we discuss a multitude of topics regarding what kids are experiencing when it comes to their mental health and forming their own identity. Today, we're going to dive even further into what this truly looks like. Hi, Dr. Gold. How are you doing today?
Hi there, Eric. I'm doing fine, thank you.
Great, great. We talked a little about in both of the episodes actually about the rise and evolution of bullying, teasing, and just overall meanness that has come specifically within the 21st century and the rise of the digital age. So, when we look at elements like social media, influencer culture, and just the internet in general, how do you think this evolution has manifested in kids and the ways in which they interact with and unfortunately bully one another?
That's a really excellent question. As I think about it, bullying and meanness have really always existed, at least in American culture. Our United States ethics of independence and one-upmanship, it's really a dominant value in this country. Everyone wants to prove that they're better than all other people and often put themselves down if they feel that they're not as good as other people at a particular skill. However, like when I was growing up, kids just used to say mean things to other kids or sometimes write notes or sometimes bully through physical attacks. But with the addition of social media, it became far easier to say and post mean statements about others without having to deal with the other person in person and with possible physical reactions, which they would get in trouble for, particularly if they did it in school. It's so easy now to impulsively post a mean statement, knowing that it will have a wide range of people seeing it and not giving any thought to how the person might react or how his or her life might be affected by those postings. So, really, what electronics has done has significantly impaired young and now older people's skills in communicating with each other. As I get older, I realize how important communication is for all people. And it's really very complicated, but incredibly important that all people, regardless of age, need to be able to understand and to be able to relate positively to each other. So, in terms of communication, people need to learn how to ask questions to better understand each other's behavior and viewpoints. They need to know how to give respectful feedback if another person does something annoying or hurtful, or if they don't agree with each other. They need to have enough self-awareness and personal questioning to ask themselves why particular actions or statements really bother them because so many people are not aware of what their own childhood might have created in terms of their emotional responses to things. They need to be able to say what they'd like the other person to do or not do to help improve their interactions or friendships. So all of this requires personal interaction, not just posting things on social media or texting. Not just writing impulsive things online. It's that face-to-face communication that's so critical for people to work things out and communicate. So without being in person, one doesn't see the nonverbal expressions to know how their comments affect the other person. I mean, is the person laughing? Is the person going like this? It's that's very, very important. I used to do groups with kids and teach them or kind of assess whether they could understand other people's nonverbal expressions. So we would one would be an actor, and I'd say, so show curiosity, show sadness, show anger, show furiousness. And, they could portray it, but not all kids could learn that. And I'm worried that now that many kids are not picking that up. So, young people now are so addicted to their phones and so used to instant postings that they're respectful and thoughtful, and really thought out communications as opposed to impulsive communications are quite limited. So I really am concerned and worried about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Yeah, and even just going right off of that, something else that we touched on in our second conversation together is how, speaking of just like online and the content that these kids are seeing online, this meanness in general and the rise and difference that we see it in now in the 21st century, it's being perpetuated by so many public and critical figures that we're exposed to constantly, whether it be on TV, in the media, on social media, and just online in general. So, how do you think we see that high, intense level of aggression and meanness kind of being woven into our kids today and in recent years in general with social media?
Well, I've certainly thought a lot about that, and I can't resist being political about it.
Mm,
I'm not going to hide my belief that a lot of meanness and bullying got exacerbated when Trump became president. Just the way, you have to look at the President of the United States as a very powerful role model for how to treat other people. In my memory, almost 80 years now. Well, I'm not 80 yet, and I don't remember from when I was 3 years old, but uh, I, the presidents were respectful to other people. They didn't always do the right thing. I'm not saying everyone was perfect, but that verbal or written meanness that comes out, not just of him, but by him, but we've seen it in actors and actresses. We've seen it in, well, I don't know about actresses, but we've seen it in sports figures and so on, and just the language that people use. But, for example, when Robert Mueller died and Trump said, "Oh, I'm glad he's dead." Now I don't know, or what I've thought a lot about is, and what I'm not sure is how that gets to children.
mm,
Um, it's and that's why it's so important, why how parents actually
right.
uh, respond to that. I think what he's done, in a sense, is given people permission to verbalize their hatred, their prejudice, their racism, their anti-religious beliefs, and so on. But, people do not need to be called losers, scum, rapists, traitors, idiots, piggies, and so on,
Mm,
particularly if there's no evidence of some of the crimes that they're accused of. Like the two people that were killed in Minnesota, um, called, domestic traitors. Well, they weren't. But who knows what people who listen to the, media are going to believe. And I'm not saying that prejudice and xenophobia and racism didn't exist in our culture before. Of course they did. Look at slavery. Look at what happened to the Japanese during World War II. Look at Chinese who were forbidden to emigrate here. Um, but when the President of the United States really openly expresses these hateful and mean feelings without any consideration for other people or any thinking about whether the stereotypes they're making are justified, that's another horrible thing that's going on right now, is the stereotyping of all groups. In every group, it doesn't matter what it is.
mm,
There's good people and there's not good people. There, I'm gay and Jewish, and there are people who are either of those. I'd like to think that most of us are not
mm,
bad, but it doesn't matter what group you're in. There's going to be bad people. But stereotyping all immigrants as um, drug dealers and rapists and all that kind of stuff, it, it's wrong. It's truly wrong, and it really perverts the atmosphere of the country right now. And my question is, how does that filter down to children,
Right.
and because I don't think they're necessarily watching TV, but they certainly use their parents as role models.
Mm,
And if their parents feel they have permission to belittle other people or make derogatory comments, their kids can certainly pick up on that. And kids, of course, use their peers as role models. So if other kids are mean and put each other down, that gives them the model that that's okay to do. And some kids may have older siblings that watch TV and pick up on this stuff. And the difficult part, it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on teachers and other school employees and administrators to set a completely different example. And like I said, it's not only the president who's a terrible role model right now, but there are athletes, news commentators, politicians, entertainers who all engage in this kind of verbal behavior. Granted, some may be in defense and others in revenge. Um, and it's interesting about revenge. I don't know if you ever watch PBS programs, but right now there's a British. I've been watching Masterpiece since it came on
mm,
television in 1971, and I talk about addiction. That's my Sunday night
mm,
television watching. But right now they're doing Count of Monte Cristo. It's I think, a six episode series. And I don't know if you know the story, but the main character was illegitimately placed in prison for 15 years on an island because he was supposedly supporting Napoleon Bonaparte. And
mm,
he escaped. And he's talking about revenge.
mm,
And I've been thinking a lot about, is revenge worth it? Um, and probably not. Um, but it's kids often feel like they've got to get back at somebody.
mm,
And if you really step back and think about why people do the mean things that they do, they may not know. They may have been treated meanly, themselves. And just their response to that, their unconscious or subconscious responses to meanness is just to get back at other people. And rather than communicating in a um, productive way, to be able to say, when you say that about me, that really hurts my feelings. Um, what did I do that bothered you? Can I try to do something else so I don't do that? But, it's often that, like, and we see that in politics. Some of, that, again, Trump's model of, if somebody disagrees with him, he goes after them, you
mm.
know. Um, so, I hope my political views aren't, inappropriate here, but this is what I've observed, and when I see this affecting kids and other adults, I get very concerned. I want the world to be a peaceful, kind place, and right now it isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that because it speaks to this larger idea and the issue we see with communication in today's world and today's era with the internet and everything. And to go back a little bit to what you were talking about with the first question, because another big part of internet culture that's impacted, like you said, not just kids, but all of us and adults, is the ways in which we now communicate with one another. And while there's obvious pros to things like texting and video calling when it comes to keeping up with our loved ones from around the world and everything, how have we also seen, though, that smart technology and social media hinder communication and stunt genuine in-person interaction with one another?
Yeah, again, an excellent question. And as I said before, effective communication, it's a very difficult and nuanced skill.
Right.
Um, but just posting our opinions without dialogue, I think, is quite ineffective and can be very hurtful because people may not know exactly what somebody else is meaning and or intending, and they don't have the opportunity um, to talk that out. Okay. So, texting and even emailing are non-dialogue. So there's really little way to understand others' opinions, reasoning, values, and even with vocabulary. What a word we use might mean something to us, but mean something different to another person, and they may take offense at it or may not understand it. Now, I think video calling and Zoom are actually better because, like, I can see you,
Right. Yeah.
If you gritted your teeth, I'd say, "Ooh, what did I say?" Uh, you know, um, and I'm talking about one-to-one or very small group video chats. I lead some groups connected to my synagogue with where we have 3, 4, 5, 6 people, and it's very easy to communicate that way, and we can see people's reactions and clarify um, uh, questionable comments and that kind of thing. So, and again, as I said earlier, when people see each other, they can read nonverbal cues and better evaluate how the other person is feeling and reacting. Um, and like I said, communication's challenging because not everyone interprets the same word or words in the same way.
Mm.
Like with kids, I would say, if one kid said, "You're mean,"
Mm.
and that can mean many different things. So I used to work with kids to explain what mean meant
Mm.
by describing very specifically the words or actions that the other person felt was mean. So, well, you're mean when you ignore me on the playground, or you're mean when you hit me to try to get my attention.
Mm.
So it's not just using one word to describe somebody, but to be very specific. And then the communication actually involves, you know, as I put it, sort of completing um, uh, this sentence. Um, if you would just do a little less of this or a little more of that, then I think our friendship would be better.
Mm.
So that helps the person understand what it gives them feedback,
Yeah.
and I don't think anybody can change without feedback.
Mm.
And I used to try to do that with kids. So if you would just not make fun of me in public, I think we could be better friends. Or if you would, we're really good friends when we have a play date at home, but then at school you don't pay any attention to me. I think we could be better friends if you would just pay attention to me a little more at school, and try to get kids to articulate what it is that bothers them. And adults have the same thing. I bet you could even think of somebody who annoys you,
Mm.
and you wish, whether it's a parent or a relative or a friend. Um, and without that feedback, we don't change.
Yeah.
Uh, because we keep on doing what our habits tell us to do, you know. So, but all of that really requires very respectful communication. How do you give feedback to somebody that they're not going to react in a pretty negative, a defensive way or an aggressive way? Why are you saying that to me? That's not nice. So people have to be very careful. That's why I say that the communication is very challenging and very nuanced. I'm not saying that it can't be done, um, but if we want somebody to change, we really need to be able to express our feelings in a respectful and gentle and kind way.
Definitely. Definitely. I love that example because I also would love to talk to you a bit about communication between now also parents and their children in this world and modern age. I do believe we touched on it a little bit in one of our interviews, but since social media started, there is now this hurdle, this other hurdle that parents have to kind of approach as their kids get older too. So from your expert opinion, how do you think parents can approach talking to their kids about social media and place appropriate limitations on it for their age, especially when combating the now classic argument, all of my friends have a phone or an Instagram or a Twitter, why can't I? So how can parents identify when they're also being too protective or on the opposite end, too lenient? And what strategies can they use to kind of find that balance in this ever-changing digital world?
Right, right. I think that's one of the most challenging situations for modern parents, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Mm,
Parents, as I have said before, are role models for their kids. And if they're always on their phones or computers in front of their kids, then the message is that that's normal and okay. Um, or, at when you go to a restaurant these days, you see people, not just kids, but adults too. They're just on their phone and they're not interacting with each other. So the message there is this is normal and this is okay. So parents have to try to limit themselves, especially at dinner time or when they're driving, hopefully, so they're not in an accident, in cars. I mean, I talk to people on the phone when I'm in a car and driving someplace, but I don't have to touch the phone. It's all on the screen there, or it's so. But parents should model interaction with each other and demonstrate good personal communication. And in this day and age, it's not realistic to totally forbid use of phones and computers, but they can limit use of social media
mm,
by encouraging in-person play dates and hanging out with peers. Um, you know, Also, parents need to limit their giving kids iPads and phones when they're very young. Okay.
mm,
Great. They're great babysitters now. Kids can watch when they're 2 or 3 years old. They can, watch little cartoons on the iPad or whatever. But that can start addicting them to electronics because what they do at 2 and 3 is not what they're going to do at 7 or 8
mm,
or 9 or 10. Once they're exposed to all this stuff, I don't know if I mentioned before, but when a number of years ago, a parent of a seventh grader came to me because she had discovered her son was looking at pornography. And we talked about that as a teachable moment. Um, but then as years progressed, I ended up talking to parents of third graders who either accidentally or were told to look at pornographic websites. And that's really negative, but just all the violent video games and all that kind of stuff. So there's even an organization called Wait Until Eighth, where parents agree not to give their kids cell phones until they graduate from eighth grade.
mm,
And parents can certainly explain to their kids the dangers of social media. And we know now from research that kids, often girls, are very negatively impacted by social media. They see these pictures of beautiful or handsome kids their age, and who knows if they're real.
mm,
They compare themselves, as I said earlier, and with this interview, that it's very natural for Americans to compare themselves up to other people,
mm,
and they get depressed, if they compare themselves to pictures of other people, other people's statements of accomplishments, whether they've really done it or not. And they don't know if what's posted is the truth. So it's really the responsibility of parents to help their kids develop positive self-esteem,
mm,
again, without over-inflating them, but not over-criticizing them so that they feel bad about themselves and are vulnerable to better kids on so that they see on social media. So I really feel very empathic for parents because it's so hard to deal with all this stuff. But they also have to be able to set limits, not have their phones in the bedroom because that has negative effects on their sleep, have time limits on their how long they're on the media. I really would like to see some research done on because you mentioned it, what if everybody else has a phone? Are they going to be rejected?
Mm,
Uh, and, well, everybody else gets to have this. Why can't I? And they feel deprived and angry. Um, I don't know if somebody didn't have, the electronics until they were like teenagers, if they would be rejected. I mean, fortunately, school is still an in-person place, and so they have to talk to people. Um, but I think the more the parents can encourage kids to actually talk to friends on the phone, um, even loaning their own phones to their kids if they don't have one themselves. I remember when I was, a teenager or something, I would spend time on the phone, and it's important to do that. Now, so many adults just text other people, and they don't actually spend the time on the phone. It's better than just texting. But it is perfectly fine for parents to put limitations on electronic usage, especially on school nights. Um, you know, but again, it's difficult these days because so many schools have computers and kids use them for their work and so on. Although now with AI and the interference of artificial intelligence, more and more teachers are limiting kids' um, ability to, not ability, but permission to write essays and things on the computer because they can use AI. So they actually have to take tests and write essays in class and write them themselves. Um, and again, it's hard for kids to um, give up all of these things, and for parents, it's very hard for parents to set limits. So I always recommended, it's perfectly okay if a parent says, no, it's a school night, you can't be on the computer. But if they give them, it's really a good way to test to see if kids are getting addicted to these things.
mm,
So, for example, they could be limited to a half hour of games on a school night, and if the parent gives a, hey, it's 5 minutes, you got 5 minutes more, um, and then get off the computer. Um, Maybe the kid says, "Oh, I just need another 2 minutes to finish this game." And then the kid gets off. That says that he or she has some control over their ability to get off the equipment. But if 2 minutes after the time limit becomes 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 30 minutes and a big argument ensues, then addiction is likely, and there should be not be phones or iPads or computers on school nights. And parents should be willing to take them away, even on weekends, and encourage other activities. I mean, I remember, oh, years ago, I asked, I had a social skills group of third graders, and I asked them what they did outside. And this was sort of at the beginning of phones and computers. And one kid said, "Oh, I love to go out on the patio and play video games."
mhm,
I was pretty appalled actually, because I wanted kids to say, "Oh, I take a bike ride, or I go hiking with my friend, or we play baseball or tennis, or go swimming." I want kids to be active and interact personally. Um, and that's when that doesn't happen, I really worry about it, and it has that negative effect on communication that I've said. Now, for parents, you asked at the beginning, how do parents, um, monitor all this stuff? And I think one difference, I don't know how your parents were, but when I was growing up, parents were parents. They
mhm,
were the bosses. And now you see this kind of confusion among parents because they want to be friends with their kids. Um, but this is one area, particularly with electronics and social media, they have to be the managers. They have to be able to say, or at least determine that the child can not be sneaky and can control his or her time on the computers. But and it's important that they explain exactly why they need to limit the social media and electronics usage. So they need to be able to discuss their values with each other first. Hopefully, they can agree,
Mm.
um, and uh, and then find a way to communicate with their kids, regardless of how old they are. You know, I don't know that you have to do that at age 3, but probably, from 5 on, you'd have to be able to say why these things should be limited, what the parent is worried about, without putting the child down. But, you know, um, the explaining their values. I want you to learn how to talk to people. This is really important. How to do that in an effective way where you know what somebody else is saying and you can tell that person. And texting is not the way to do that. Um, I don't want you to compare yourself to other people when you're not even sure that what you're seeing on this media is really true. I want you to compare yourself to yourself. If you really want to be better at something, how do you do that?
Mm.
Well, I practice a lot. Um, it, and I also want you to be creative. I want you to use your brain and your imagination for play and for making uh, inventing things, not just playing on video games. Um, I want you to have interaction with us. We are a family. We love each other. We care about each other. So, and mommy and daddy are not going to spend their time, even though we have to do this for work sometime. When you're up, we're going to spend at least a good bit of the time with you so that we can have fun together and share our experiences. So all those are important values, I think, that a parent needs to um, be able to communicate to their kids. And you had also asked, how can parents figure out when they're being too lenient or
Right.
or too stringent? And as I said, and I'll say it over and over again, parenting is one of the most challenging occupations now. And they must be well aware of how their parenting is affecting their children's behavior and emotions. If they're too lenient, they may see their children take unhealthy risks, knowing that they won't be punished.
Mm.
When they're little, maybe not a lot, but as they're teenagers, if they feel that they don't have any boundaries, they may start smoking weed or beginning to have sex or drinking, although I understand that drinking is now less than it was, but um, or they may take some physical risks that they shouldn't be doing. Um, but if they're being too strict, then they'll get a lot of pushback and as we said, statements that other kids get to do something, why can't they? So it's very important to have open communication with kids about parental goals for their children and frankly how children can build trust with them. Trust I used to talk to kids a lot about, how do you get your parents to trust you? Because if parents really trust kids, then they're going to be more lenient with them, or they will give them permission to try some things that maybe they wouldn't if they couldn't trust their kids. So it's really for parents, they have to create an effective balance in parenting by knowing and stating their own values, expressing their concerns about some behaviors, being comfortable setting limits, like with electronic use, and showing how kids following parental guidelines gradually builds trust and they can earn more freedom.
Mm.
Like most 10-year-olds, the parents are reasonably comfortable letting them walk over to their friend's house or walk to the store or something like that. But showing responsibility as a child, it's a powerful way to build trust and respect for parents. So if kids do their household chores without being nagged and, asked all the time to do it, if they are responsible about doing their homework, if they share experiences with their parents that may be very difficult, and kids like privacy. The older they get, the more private they want to be. But parents could say, if you're undergoing a situation at school or outside of school that you really don't know what to do, and you tell us, we're not going to punish you for that. We'll help you. That's where parents can be good consultants, ask the right questions, help the child solve those problems. But if children keep everything secret all the time, that doesn't build trust either because the parent doesn't know what's going on. Um, Now, if parents are very scared for their children's safety and are overly restrictive, then perhaps they need parental counseling themselves. I think I've mentioned before, when I was growing up, I was an only child. I had polio when I was 8 years old, and my parents had me when they were 48 and 43, and they were very, very protective. But they still let me, when I was 10 or 11, I could go traveling all on the bus all over San Francisco or take walks. They weren't particularly, I wouldn't call them helicopter parents. And of course, in those days, there were no cell phones, so they didn't know where I was. Um, so I really admired them for, in retrospect, for not keeping me under their thumb all the time. Um, but helicopter parents, that's the current term for people who are, know exactly what their kids are doing all the time. They're really not helpful in developing independent kids because, everybody makes mistakes and learns from them. So if the helicopter parent is there directing their kid all the time, um, then I don't think that's useful. Yes, you may be afraid, depending on where you live. Is it safe for a kid to go out by him or herself? Is he or she going to get kidnapped? I think, the current society is a fearful one. We're afraid that something could happen to our kid. And, so I understand the protectiveness of parents, but better to, let kids, particularly if there's two or three kids, friends going out by themselves, um, then, they can help protect each other. But, the truth of life is you can't control everything. And you can talk to kids certainly. What if you're out taking a walk or walking to the store and some man approaches you and wants you to help him with something or come in his car? How do you deal with that? I used to work with kids about fourth or fifth grade about how do you deal with strangers. Parents will say, "Don't talk to strangers," but they need to have the practice in knowing really what to do if the situation presents itself. So, but again, I think I mentioned that parental counseling, I think, is extremely valuable, particularly while kids are, even before two people have children, to see if their values are similar, and to discuss how would they handle particular situations. Is one a really lenient parent? Did one have very strict parents and wants to be lenient? Um, did one feel that they were raised in a very good way and they want to raise their kids the same way? So I think it's important, more than important, it's critical, I think, for two parents to really examine, do they have the same values? Do they have the same interventions? Present situations. How would you handle this if your kid is sassy to you? How would you handle this if your kid doesn't do his or her homework? How would you handle it if your kid accidentally breaks something, are you going to blow up or what do you want? If your kid does something wrong, how do you want, what kind of punishment or what kind of reaction are you going to give? And if the two parents can find compromising and agreement, then that presents a much stronger um, reaction to whatever the kid does. And if parents can plan that out before the child does these things, because most parent, kids will do something that you weren't expecting, and then how do you handle it? Better to have thought it through and then follow your plan on how to deal with it. And it's perfectly okay if a kid does something. You say, Dad and I or Mom and I have to talk about this a bit. So just chill for a minute and we'll come and talk to you about it. So, like I said, you know, parenting is very, very challenging and trying to find a way to really do it effectively. I'm not saying that all parents are going to be perfect because they're not, but it takes hard work.
Definitely. Definitely. No. And, in that same vein, talking about these really big and important conversations that parents and their children have, I want to kind of touch on the whole mental health aspect of it as well, because one of my favorite parts of, I believe it was the first podcast we did together, is we talked a lot about this idea of creating and being a safe space for your kids and for kids in general. So, in that kind of light, what can parents do to normalize conversations about mental health in their house and reduce the stigma to their children? How can parents almost, I guess, even look out themselves for early signs of anxiety, depression, or other mental health struggles in their children? And then what steps can they take to address those concerns as well?
Yeah. Um, Again, that's one of the I think most parents are probably fairly aware. I mean, if they're working all the time, I don't know, but anxiety and depression and other mental health issues are generally not so difficult to sense at home. I mean, sometimes parents will be hyper um, sensitive to these things. They really love their kids, but it's better, I think, to notice rather than not notice. If children are constantly worried about going to school or playing with friends, or don't have friends, they're not developing friendships, or if they talk about bullying or teasing, or if they isolate themselves in their rooms, if they don't get off their phones or computers, um, if they're being very clingy to a parent, if they're fighting with their siblings or parents all the time, if they're being mean or disrespectful to other, whether it's adults or parents or teachers, other people. These are all signs of mental health issues. I could go on and on with that. Um, I think a very good first step is to consult with teachers and the school psychologist or counselor at school to see if the behaviors observed at home are also present at school. And there's nothing the matter at all. In fact, I recommend it. Have a check-in appointment with the school psychologist. Um, the parent can describe what they're concerned about at home, and then if the school psychologist has formed a relationship or can form a decent relationship with the kid, they can, spend time together trying to figure out what's going on. Now, I will say, not all students are willing to talk or even understand what's going on inside themselves. Maybe they don't want to be labeled at school as having something the matter with them. That's the stigmatism that we've talked about. Um, but in that case, particularly if the student is showing similar behaviors at home and at school, isolating him or herself, or being nasty to, other kids or teachers, then outside therapy would be recommended. Now, not all insurance pays for that, but there are sliding scales where parents can, get a social worker and work with a therapist. Um, and Also, the teachers and the school psychologists should be in regular contact with the therapist to inform the therapist. You know, the therapist, because of confidentiality, wouldn't have to say anything that the kid is doing, but, often, um, whether it's adult clients or kids, people don't always tell the therapist everything. And, I've suggested to many parents, even parents of like college students or relatives of adults, call the therapist, let him or her know what some of the issues are. Don't expect any uh, feedback about what the client is saying, but it can be helpful. And, a good therapist would find a way to introduce those topics so that the person could talk about it. So, I think how parents raise their kids is crucial to convey the message that all people have feelings that may be challenging as well as uplifting. So I think, parents should teach their kids the vocabulary of emotions,
Mhm.
not just happy, sad, and angry, but there's a wide range of feelings, that are subtle feelings. And, for example, parents can share at dinner time their own daily feelings about situations, which can normalize expressing feelings for kids to do.
Mhm.
If parents hide their feelings, the message is, oh, I shouldn't talk about my feelings. Um, and it took me a while to learn how to do that because my parents, maybe because of the society that they grew up in, I don't think shared much about their feelings.
Mhm.
They would demonstrate, like my mother was a hugger and things like that. So I knew that there was love there, but they didn't really express very much about, their own feelings. But I think for parents to say specifically how they handle challenging emotional situations in the present, um, and especially when they were kids too. If they had their own therapist at any time in their lives, then I think they can tell their kids how that was helpful to them, assuming it was. Um, so discussion about feelings, recognition of therapy, and talking about dealing actively with challenging situations can help to normalize and destigmatize mental health support. So particularly if parents do talk about this, when I was your age, I felt really isolated because kids weren't talking about me, and I talked to my mom and dad about it, and they had me talk to the school psychologist at school,
Mhm.
and it helped me understand that there were a couple of things that I did that I could change, and it really helped. I worked on some things and I made some friends. Like, now, mom has lots of friends, but it took me a while to learn that. But if I hadn't have mentioned it, I wouldn't have been able to, change those things. So, normalizing, discussing feelings, and working on them in a positive and effective way. Now, is that going to work with every kid? Probably not, but it's better to try something than to ignore, particularly if a kid is showing depression and anxiety. That really is so limiting, and that can really limit both social growth and academic growth.
Definitely, yeah. No, I appreciate you mentioning the importance of that dialogue between school psychologist or counselor and the teachers and the parents themselves to kind of navigate what is best for that specific child, because I do want to now kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about how you kind of operated when you were in that seat yourself, because we've talked about before and you've emphasized the importance of teamwork in what you did and in a school system in general for kids. So how can school psychologists now kind of foster strong connections for collaborating with teachers administrators, parents, and vice versa, so that they can create a sort of unified approach to a student and a child's well-being.
Yeah. Well, as you've implied or said, building strong relationships with teachers, administrators, and parents is especially important for school psychologists to develop. I mean, it's even important for, as I was suggesting earlier, for private therapists to, develop those same kind of relationships with people who are also involved with their clients. And it should be easier as a school psychologist because you're working on a campus and you have these connections. But the more I think about it, I think the psychologist's personality characteristics are really crucial to developing these connections. Um, they need to be socially comfortable and not shy.
Mm,
Um, when it's appropriate, to be open about themselves. So to be able to be, yeah, I'm a human being too. I have emotions and feelings, not just, this wise yoga, kind of person. Um, and they need to be excellent consultants. I've talked about parents as consultants, but I was trained actually in consultation. So what does that mean? That means you're a good listener. You're good at asking relevant questions. You're good at brainstorming um, solutions to problems. Um, and it's also important to make those social connections with people, to find ways to get to know each other personally without seeming to be nosy or intrusive. The first thing you say um, as a new school psychologist, oh, are you married? Do you have children? Are you having an affair with somebody? You
mhm,
don't ask those kind of personal questions. But over time, you can get to know. I mean, I had teachers who would, over time, if they had their own personal issues with their own children or their own parents, they would use me as a consultant to talk about that, you know. So I think that that was a very positive way to, develop the teamwork. And when you ask questions, that's so important,
mm,
because the just asking of questions has the implication that you are really interested in knowing more about the person. So if you're were asking a teacher question or an administrator about a kid, you want to try to find out, particularly with teachers, find out as much as possible what triggers students' behaviors or academic challenges, because you're ultimately going to have to figure out what to assess and what's going on, but to try to understand what parents and teachers have already done to address the students' problems, and try to understand the values that underlie their actions, particularly for parents. You know, how come you're doing, explain why you have this response to um, his misbehaving and that, or to his difficulty with um, school, and to try to not do it in a pushy way, but to really, I need to understand so I can work with you to find something to do. And it's important not always to be the strong advisor. Oh, this is what you got to do.
mm,
You know, I rarely did that. I mean, if I knew a parent really well, and like, for example, if I really thought they needed to start medication to deal with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I could say, I really feel strongly that you should do this, but
mm,
I would never say do it, like that. Um, so and I would ask a parent or a teacher how they deal with their feelings when they don't see an intervention working. This happens a lot with teachers, and it certainly happens with parents. Usually what teachers and parents will often do is they do a little of something and it's not working, so they do more of it and more of it and more of it, and they have to recognize that it's not working. So for the school psychologist to assess if they're willing to try something new and then to, as part of the consultation, brainstorm some ideas to see if they're willing to give another intervention a chance. And you can say, do you think a new intervention would be possible? Would you be able to do that? Is that too demanding for you? Because you're a teacher and you've got all these other kids to deal with. And would you agree that you this goes along with your values about teaching, or would that be really different and you're not don't want to do that. So you try to get them committed to try a new tactic for a period of time. But you want to be very human in your relationships with all these people and to create the teamwork. Use humor if appropriate. People like to laugh, and I did that. As when I could, with the staff, if I could do something funny, if it wasn't in the middle of like a really serious thing. Like I remember when one of my schools, if it was raining, pouring outside, I would come in and I would collapse on the floor and say, "I'm melting," like the wicked witch of the West or something. And because I think to be playful. Um, and kids like that too. If again, all this has to be if it's appropriate. And sharing your own life situations is a if that's appropriate too. As I um, became more experienced, if it were relevant for me to share my own life experience with a kid. For instance, if a kid were being teased or bullied because he or she was very short, I could say, I know what you're talking about because I was a really short kid and people used to tease me all the time. So I really understand. If you can make that connection with a kid too, because you understand their experiences.
Mm.
So, all of that is, so important. Um, and if you develop positive relationships with your team members, that allows the psychologist to express their opinions, their experiential wisdom, and suggestions in a way that other adults can accept and try. They really trust you too, that you're you know um, really doing your best job to try to help the child or help them.
Right. Definitely, definitely. Well, for my last two questions, they are kind of like big and like a little bit open-ended, but I want to ask them because one, I think it'll leave room for future conversations between the two of us, but also I like the idea of kind of us ending off on a little bit of a spot of reflection. So when thinking about your amazing career, what is one of the things you would consider to be your most significant contribution to the field of school psychology?
Well, it's a little difficult to determine accurately as because I'm the one making the statement.
Mhm.
But when I think about it, I would say that my ability to destigmatize mental health for students and families was a major contribution. Um, I strongly felt that by engaging with as many students as possible in classrooms and general activities, even including doing cameo appearances in school plays, they would see that I'm a normal human being. And I was able to demonstrate my basic humanity and not come across as someone who only dealt with very emotionally disturbed or academically disabled students. Um, so if school psychologists can find activities that engage a large range of students, including gifted kids, socially struggling kids, and these are all kids that I dealt with who weren't necessarily, the most behaviorally challenged or the most academically challenged. I would work with um, kids having problems communicating with friends, children of divorce, those needing organization skills, those with special needs siblings who, you know, people wouldn't think about them, but I did. Children with sick or dying parents, adopted kids, culturally different kids, kids good at math because I ran math clubs for 35 or 40 years. Any other group needing support. That's one thing that I was able to do. If some discussion came up and I felt like I could make a contribution. Um, to either an individual, a small group, or a whole class, teachers would ask me to do that. So I think what I did was, give school psychology sort of I used to call myself a Renaissance man
Mhm.
because I had so many different hats that I wore and um, that I enjoyed doing. It wasn't just um, sit down, we're going to do some testing, and or even just the counseling. So I think the school psychologist, by doing this range of things, even during lunchtime, like at middle school, I ran a teach equity and acceptance group and a gender, sexuality, and alliance group. So these weren't necessarily kids who, had horrible needs, but it was horrible isn't the right word, but very demanding needs. Uh, and you could be with a lot of different kids. So then I think more and more kids would be comfortable relying on any support that a school psychologist could offer, assuming that they um, needed it at some time. And I think another contribution I made that I loved doing was to do annual or biannual or semi-annual rather grade level parent meetings where I used to discuss physical, cognitive, social, emotional, and moral development of children of each age. So parents from kindergarten through eighth grade were invited to these hour and a half meetings where I would discuss each of those, but then open it up to parents to ask their questions. And what it did was create a community of parents who could work with each other, because it takes a village, that expression. And if parents feel that, well, we're all going through this, or where's my kid fit in this developmental range? And I really encouraged parents, particularly the older they got, to make good friends with other parents because um, we would talk about privacy. And, as kids get older, adolescents, they don't tell their parents everything. And they may tell their friend, and their friend might tell a parent. And I would ask parents all the time, if if your child's friend knew something about your child that you didn't know and told their parent, would you want to know? And no parent ever said they wouldn't want to know. So those groups, it helped me form relationships with parents. They knew they could talk to me if they needed to. We didn't talk at those groups, we didn't talk about very personal kinds of things, but it gave them an opportunity. I really need to talk to you about this situation. Can we make an appointment? And of course I would. Um, so I think I did made some contributions to, I'm not saying I'm the only school psychologist that did that by any means, but when I think back on my own career, it felt like those were some really positive things to make uh, school psychology a very useful field.
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, yeah. And reflecting on everything we talked about today and even in our past two podcasts together and just thinking about the world in relation to what we talked about, from your perspective, if you could implement one like nationwide policy to improve mental health support in schools specifically, what would it be and why?
Well, I believe that young people need mental health support now more than ever. Um, And given the state of the country and the world and the possible effects of AI and social media on relationships and job availability, there's much for young people to worry about for their present and future. Um, I'm not saying that in the past kids didn't have to worry about divorce and friendship and bullying and all that, but if you add all these other things, you don't know what is going to impact a child or a, or a teenager. So I would strongly recommend a national movement to increase available counseling, social work, and psychology for students at schools.
Mm.
Schools are the most convenient place for, they don't cost any money like private therapy does. The National Association of School Psychologists has a recommendation for the ratio of school psychologists to students, 1 to 5 to 700 students. So one school psychologist to 5 to 700. I'd even recommend less because it doesn't mean you have to do therapy with every student weekly like a private therapist would do. But nationally, it's 1 to 1,200 or 1,500 in many school districts. So that's a lot of work for one person to really address those needs. And the more people that are available for a student at school, hopefully it destigmatizes the offering of that kind of help, more people taking that help. And I think supportive graduate students and programs financially to encourage more college students to select school psychology as a career would be a great benefit. To encourage people who are culturally different, because there's so many kids in our country that are from different cultures and or they're African American and to introduce mental or Hispanic, to introduce mental health um, services. Now, it's important, because not all cultures accept that, so that would be another whole challenge would be how do we get people from different cultures or different backgrounds to accept mental health for their kids. So it takes a lot of work. Um, but I think if the government really, if the Department of Education really focused on, of course, Trump wants to destroy the Department of Education, um, but I think if, and I don't think that AI, for example, can take over what a school psychologist can do. Now they do have AI therapists, I think, where you call and that kind of thing, but just the interaction, you need a human being to do this and to, promote, for having publicity in colleges for psychology majors to go into school psychology, I think would be a wonderful nationwide policy to do that. But so much of education now is STEM, science, technology, and all of that. But that doesn't mean, and as I said, kids need mental health support now more than ever before. And so I think if the federal government and state governments found a way to really encourage mental health support, because we don't want, kids to grow up and be homeless and take drugs and all of that stuff. We see it, and San Francisco is a very good example of all the, homeless people and the, fentanyl and all the drugs that people get addicted to. And, what were these kids' lives like as children? Because, I am absolutely certain that how we are raised and how we develop really has a long-lasting impact on how we end up as adults.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Well, Dr. Gold, thank you so much again for taking the time to speak with me about these important topics and offering your expertise and experiences. It really is always inspiring to talk to you, and it's always a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you for your wonderful, wonderful questions because they're, um, not easy questions to answer.
Mm.
And I'm sure other school psychologists or psychologists might have different answers, but I hope that the ideas that you let me talk about can be helpful to some people or many
Definitely.
people. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think so. And, once again, for everyone at home, for more information on Dr. Gold, and I highly implore you to check out all of our previous episodes with him as well, all of which is the links in the description. Once again, I'm Eric Mastrota, and this has been Their Journey, a sit down with the National Digest. Take care, everyone.